Right now, your eyes are doing something so complex that no technology on Earth can fully replicate it. They are converting electromagnetic radiation into electrochemical signals, sending roughly 10 million bits of data per second down each optic nerve. And your visual cortex, the largest sensory processing area in your brain, is assembling that data into a seamless, three-dimensional, full-color model of the world around you in real time. You are not even trying. You are not even aware of it. It just happens. Now turn it off. All of it. Not dim, not blurry, gone. The landscape, the faces, the fire, the movement of animals on the horizon, the body language of the person sitting across from you, all of it replaced by nothing. You are a Homo sapiens living somewhere in the Levant 50,000 years ago, and you cannot see. The question is not whether you are going to die. The question is how you are going to live. Most people assume blindness in the ancient world was an automatic death sentence. No sight, no hunting, no foraging, no defense against predators, no ability to navigate terrain, no way to contribute. A blind person in a mobile foraging band was dead weight, a liability, a mouth to feed, with nothing to offer in return. That assumption is wrong. And the reason it is wrong has to do with something happening inside the skull of every blind person who has ever lived. Something the brain does automatically that turns a catastrophic loss into a different kind of competence entirely. But first, the harder question. How common was blindness in the ancient world? More common than most people think, and the causes were relentless. Start with cataracts. Age-related cataracts, the gradual clouding of the crystalline lens of the eye, are the single most common cause of blindness in human history. They are not a disease. They are a certainty. Given enough time, every human lens will opacify. In the modern world, cataract surgery is the most frequently performed surgical procedure on the planet, with roughly 20 million operations per year. Without that surgery, the lens continues to cloud until functional vision is gone. In the Paleolithic, any human who lived past the age of 45 or 50 was increasingly likely to develop significant lens opacity, not overnight, gradually. A slow narrowing of the visual field, a progressive loss of contrast and color, a growing haze that turned the sharp-edged world into something soft and unreliable. For people who survived into their 60s, which the archaeological record confirms some did, severe visual impairment or total blindness from cataracts was essentially inevitable. Then there was trachoma. Trachoma is a bacterial infection of the eye caused by the organism Chlamydia trachomatis, and it has been blinding humans for as long as there have been humans to blind. It spreads through direct contact, through shared materials that touch the face, and, critically, through flies that feed on ocular secretions. In warm climates with limited water for washing, trachoma would have been endemic. Repeated infections scar the inner surface of the eyelid, causing the lashes to turn inward and abrade the cornea with every blink. The condition is called trichiasis, and it is excruciatingly painful. Left untreated, and there was no treatment, it produces corneal scarring and irreversible blindness, sometimes in both eyes simultaneously. Trauma was the third pathway. A Homo sapiens or Neanderthal living a physically demanding life in close proximity to large animals, stone tools, thorned vegetation, campfire sparks, and interpersonal violence faced constant risk of eye injury. The orbital bone, the socket that houses the eye, is among the most commonly fractured facial bones in ancient skeletal remains. Shanidar I, the Neanderthal from the Zagros Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan, whose remains were excavated by Ralph Selecki beginning in 1951, showed damage to the left orbital bone consistent with a crushing blow that almost certainly destroyed vision in that eye. He survived for decades afterward, and in equatorial Africa, there was onchocerciasis, river blindness, a parasitic infection caused by the filarial worm Onchocerca volvulus, transmitted by the bite of black flies that breed in fast-flowing rivers. The larval worms migrate through the skin and eventually reach the eyes, where the immune response to dying microfilaria produces inflammation that destroys the cornea and retina. In modern sub-Saharan Africa, river blindness remains one of the leading causes of preventable blindness. In the Paleolithic, for any group living near the rivers that were also their primary water source, exposure would have been continuous and unavoidable. Add it all together, and the picture is clear. Blindness was not a freak occurrence in the ancient world. It was a regular feature of human life, especially among older group members. Any band of 25 to 30 people almost certainly included at least one individual with severe visual impairment at any given time. And over the lifespan of the group, many members would have experienced progressive vision loss if they lived long enough. So how did they survive it? And this is where the story takes a turn that has nothing to do with compassion and everything to do with neuroscience. In 1996, the neurologist Alvaro Pascual Leone, then at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center affiliated with Harvard Medical School, published a study that fundamentally changed how science understood the blind brain. Using transcranial magnetic stimulation, he demonstrated that the occipital cortex, the region at the back of the brain normally devoted exclusively to processing visual information, was being actively recruited for tactile processing in people who had been blind from an early age. When blind subjects read Braille, their visual cortex lit up. Their visual cortex, the part of the brain that should have been processing light, was processing touch instead. This was not a subtle finding. The visual cortex in a sighted person contains roughly 280 million neurons. That is an enormous amount of neural real estate. In a blind individual, the brain does not let that real estate sit idle. It repurposes it. The phenomenon is called cross-modal neuroplasticity, and it means that a blind person is not simply a sighted person minus vision. They are a person whose brain has fundamentally reorganized itself, reassigning its most powerful processing hardware to the senses that remain. The results are measurable. Blind individuals consistently outperform sighted individuals on tests of auditory spatial localization, the ability to identify where a sound is coming from. They show enhanced pitch discrimination. They show superior tactile acuity. They show better performance on verbal memory tasks. These are not small differences. In some studies, the performance gap is dramatic, and this rewiring is not slow. Pascual Leone's later work showed that even temporary blindfolding of sighted subjects for as little as 5 days produced measurable recruitment of the visual cortex for non-visual tasks. The brain begins repurposing unused visual hardware almost immediately when the eyes stop providing input. Think about what this means for an ancient human going blind from cataracts over the course of several years. As the visual world dimmed, month by month, their brain was quietly reassigning hundreds of millions of neurons to hearing, touch, spatial memory, and sound processing. By the time their vision was gone, their other senses were not just compensating, they were operating on neural hardware that a sighted person does not have access to. A blind person in a Paleolithic camp was hearing things that sighted people were not, processing sounds with a precision that no one else in the group could match. And this is where a man named Daniel Kish becomes relevant to a story about people who lived 50,000 years ago. Daniel Kish is a behavioral scientist and the president of World Access for the Blind, an organization based in the United States. He has been blind since the age of 13 months after both eyes were removed due to retinoblastoma, a childhood cancer of the retina. Kish navigates the world using a technique he calls flash sonar. He produces sharp tongue clicks and listens to the returning echoes to construct a spatial map of his environment. He can identify the size, shape, distance, and density of objects around him. He rides a bicycle. He hikes alone in wilderness. He has trained hundreds of other blind individuals to do the same. This is not echolocation in the metaphorical sense. Functional MRI studies of Kish and other expert echolocators, conducted by the neuroscientist Mel Goodale at the University of Western Ontario, confirmed that the returning echoes are processed in the visual cortex, specifically in areas normally responsible for spatial mapping. The blind brain is using sound to see. The neural architecture for spatial vision has not been destroyed. It has been reconnected to a different input. Now, consider this capability in a Paleolithic context. An ancient human who lost their vision gradually and lived in a rich acoustic environment, wind in grass, water over stone, animal calls, the crackle and pop of a fire, footsteps on different substrates, would have developed spatial hearing far beyond what any sighted person possessed. They would not have needed to develop a formal technique like Kish's tongue clicks. The ambient soundscape of the natural world was already providing constant acoustic information. A blind person sitting at the center of a camp at night was receiving a continuous stream of spatial data from the darkness around them, data that every sighted person in the group was largely ignoring because their brains were devoted to vision. A blind person was not deaf to the world. They were, in a specific and measurable neurological sense, listening to it more deeply than anyone else. And here is where most accounts of ancient disability stop. They describe the care. They describe the group rallying to feed and protect the vulnerable member. And that care was real. It was essential. No blind person in the Paleolithic survived without the support of others. But care is only half the story. The other half is contribution, because the assumption that a blind person had nothing to offer a foraging band does not survive contact with what blind people can actually do. Consider the tasks that constituted daily life in a Paleolithic camp. hide processing, sinew preparation, fiber twisting for cordage, grinding ochre. Napping stone, which is as much a tactile and auditory skill as a visual one. Experienced nappers report that the sound of the strike and the feel of the platform tell them more about the fracture than their eyes do. Tending a fire through the night, a task that is performed largely by feel, sound, and smell. Preparing plant foods by stripping, pounding, and soaking. Caring for infants and young children, a role that involves constant physical contact, vocalization, and touch. None of these tasks require vision. All of them require skill, patience, tactile sensitivity, and experience. An older group member who had spent decades mastering these skills before losing their sight would not have suddenly lost the knowledge. They would have retained it. And with the enhanced tactile processing provided by cross-modal neuroplasticity, they may have performed some of these tasks better than their sighted counterparts. But there is something else, something that may have mattered more than any physical contribution: knowledge. In a non-literate society, knowledge does not exist on a shelf. It exists in the minds of the people who carry it. The location of seasonal water sources, the migration patterns of herds, which plants are edible, which are toxic, which are medicinal, the genealogies of kin groups, the alliances and debts and grudges that structure social relationships, the stories that encode group identity. All of this information exists only as long as someone remembers it. Older group members were the primary carriers of this knowledge, and older group members were exactly the people most likely to be going blind. The grandmother hypothesis, developed by the anthropologist Kristen Hawkes at the University of Utah, argues that post-reproductive older women were critical to group survival precisely because of the knowledge and labor they provided. Their value was not in their eyesight. It was in their memory, their experience, their understanding of patterns that younger members had not yet lived through. A blind elder sitting by the fire was not a burden. They were a library, a repository of information that could not be replaced if they died. Keeping them alive was not charity. It was strategic. It was protecting the group's most irreplaceable resource. And here is where this connects to a pattern so widespread across human cultures that it almost certainly has roots deep in the Paleolithic. The blind seer, the blind storyteller, the blind musician, the blind oracle. Tiresias, in Greek mythology, blinded by the gods and granted prophetic vision. Homer, traditionally described as blind, composing the foundational narratives of Western literature. The Norse god Odin, who sacrificed an eye at the well of Mimir in exchange for wisdom. Across dozens of unrelated cultures, on every inhabited continent, blindness is associated not with helplessness, but with a different and sometimes superior form of knowledge. Anthropologists have debated this pattern for over a century. Some dismiss it as romantic projection, but there is a simpler, more grounded explanation. Blind individuals, freed from the dominance of visual processing, oriented towards sound, memory, and narrative, and often occupying a social position that involved sitting at the center of the group while others ranged outward, were ideally positioned to become the group's storytellers, historians, and oral encyclopedists. Their blindness was not incidental to this role. It was, in a very real cognitive sense, part of what made them suited to it. A brain that is not processing 10 million bits of visual data per second has enormous processing capacity available for other things, for listening, for remembering, for constructing and maintaining complex narrative structures. The blind seer archetype may not be myth at all. It may be a cultural memory of a real social role that blind individuals occupied in foraging bands for tens of thousands of years. There is one more dimension to this, and it involves something that sighted people rarely think about, but that defined the Paleolithic experience more than almost any other single condition: darkness. Modern humans live in a world saturated with artificial light. The experience of true, total darkness, the kind where you cannot see your hand in front of your face, is something most people alive today have never encountered. For ancient humans, it was half of every day. Every night, for 12 hours in the tropics, 14 or more in higher latitudes during winter, the visual world effectively disappeared, and it went deeper than nighttime. Paleolithic humans entered caves, deep caves. Caves like Chauvet and Lascaux and Fontegaume and Altamira, where art was created in chambers hundreds of meters from the entrance, in passages so narrow and so far from daylight that even with an animal fat lamp, functional vision was reduced to a flickering circle of a few feet. Beyond that circle, nothing. Absolute dark. Navigation by memory, by touch, by the feel of the cave wall under your fingers, by the sound of your own footsteps, echoing differently as the passage widened or narrowed. Everyone in the group was functionally blind underground. And the person in the group who had spent months or years learning to navigate the world without sight, whose brain had already reorganized to process spatial information through sound and touch, whose hands could read surfaces and textures with a precision no sighted person could match, that person was not disabled in the dark. They were the expert. Right now, your eyes are feeding you so much information that you cannot imagine functioning without them. You measure distance with your eyes. You read emotion with your eyes. You navigate, hunt, recognize, assess danger, find food, and connect with other humans primarily through vision. Losing it feels like losing everything. But the brain that built the ancient world, the brain that mapped landscapes, maintained fire through 12-hour nights, created art in total darkness, stored entire encyclopedias of ecological knowledge without writing a single word down, that brain was never fully dependent on any single input channel. It was built to adapt, built to reassign, built to find a way through. The most extraordinary thing ancient humans did with blindness was not that they survived it. It is that they made it useful. They let the blind person listen when everyone else was looking. They let the blind person remember when everyone else was busy. They let the blind person lead them through the dark when no one else could find the way. And maybe that is the thing worth sitting with. Not that ancient humans were kind enough to care for their blind, but that they were smart enough to listen to them.